Thank you. Okay, welcome everyone. We are starting a little bit later than expected. Our apologies. This is a new platform, and so we are still working through the technological difficulties, but I think it's still, worthy of trying out this new platform outside of just a standard Zoom conference. I see a number of new names on the gathering attendee list, and so I will once again introduce myself. I am Marissa Young, an associate professor at McMaster University in the Department of Sociology. I'm also the acting director for the McMaster Institute for Health Equity and the lead director for this initiative, which is the Advanced Research on Mental Health and Society, or what we have come to call ARMS. And one of the things that I just want to recognize and acknowledge is that while we're meeting virtually today, that the city of Hamilton, which this would otherwise be taking place, is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. The land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase 1792 between the Crown and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I also want to just acknowledge that the title of the symposium is meaningful. So as you can see, it is called the First ARMS Symposium Beyond the Vacuum. And hopefully you've had a chance to read through the conference guide. This is a statement that's been taken by the late Leonard Perlin, whose work was very influential in the sociology of mental health. And the quote suggests that many stressful experiences don't spring out of a vacuum and typically can be traced back to surrounding social structures and people's locations within them, which really does embody the approach that we are taking with ARMS and hope to develop, with a focus on mental health and the importance of mental health research in the social sciences, with an expectation of collaboration and interdisciplinarity. Before I get started introducing our fantastic keynote speaker, I want to give multiple thanks to all of those who made the symposium happen today. And so first and foremost, McMaster Institute for Health Equity, the Faculty of Social Sciences, specifically the Departments of Sociology, Health, Aging, and Society. A special thanks to Lindsay Goddard, Equity Burke, Rebecca Hessel from the Gilbrea Center, and Lo Gordon. But finally, I would like to give an incredible thank you to those who I've been lucky enough to work with on my close team, Dr. Diana Singh, Jessica Monaghan, and Dave Bass, without whom this symposium would not have happened. So moving forward now to excitingly introduce our spotlight keynote presenter, I would like to welcome Dr. Jason Schnicker, a professor of sociology from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Schnicker is an award-winning scholar. His 2017 book, The Diagnostic System, Why the Classifications of Psychiatric Disorders is Necessary, Difficult, and Never Settled, received the 2019 Best Book Award from the American Sociological Association Mental Health Section. Dr. Schnicker has now released a second groundbreaking, highly acclaimed book entitled Unnerved, Anxiety, Social Chains, and the Transformation of Modern Mental Health. The reviews for this book are already outstanding. For example, Dr. Bruce Link notes that, quote, Unnerved is a beautifully executed social epidemiology of anxiety in the United States. Dr. Alan Horowitz notes that Schnicker provides the most comprehensive empirical study of how social factors are related to anxiety that has not yet been written. We are absolutely delighted to have you with us, Dr. Schnicker, and I'll now turn it over to you.
Great, thank you for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here today. I'll share my screen now. I'm really happy to be here today, especially at this conference, and I'm happy to participate in Gather.town. This is a first for me, and I have to say it's a really wonderful interface. So welcome to everybody, and thanks for joining us today. As Marissa mentioned, this is going to be a talk about my book, which just came out this summer on anxiety. And I want to give you a couple of different impressions or a couple of different results today, try to summarize this book as best as I can. Let me advance the slide here. I'm going to talk about a couple things, four things in general. The first is the evolution of anxiety as a concept. And I'm going to make the argument that anxiety is, in some ways, the unstable isotope of sociology and mental health research. It's always there, but it's often hidden. It's often been dismissed as natural, but it's frequently concerning. It's a serious consideration, but it's also under the surface quite frequently. I'm going to give you some sense about how to interpret comorbidity between anxiety and depression, which is a fact that's been around for a long time, but I think how we interpret it has shaped how we, in many ways, disregarded anxiety. I'm going to talk a little bit about trends in anxiety, make the case that anxiety is increasing in a significant way. There's important cohort differences to address. And then I'm going to end with thoughts on why anxiety might be or I'm going to argue, the signature disorder of the 21st century, which is in some ways a bold claim. I'm going to provide a couple different data points on that and make an argument for why sociologists should study anxiety in particular more than they have. So I'll start with ancient history, in fact, an old book that is mostly forgotten and neglected at this point in time, although it's a very interesting read from the vantage of the 21st century. And it is the case that anxiety has long had special resonance, so it's no secret that the claim of an age in anxiety is historically recurrent, and I think it does have special resonance both as a scientific claim and as sort of a cultural claim, a literary claim. W.H. Auden obviously staked the claim for an age of anxiety. And I think there's a reason we often reach for anxiety as a special feature of mental health. And probably the best example of this, from the modern era that I can think of, is George Beard's American Nervousness, which was published in 1881. And I'll bring this up not because I think it's scientifically credible, but I think it sets the stage for a lot of what we talk about today, and it sort of brings to light some of the issues that are still ongoing. So in American Nervousness, he created the diagnosis of neurasthenia, famously, and in that broader category, anxiety is especially significant. So he talks about the different elements of fear. But he achieved a couple of other things in this book, and so he argued that anxiety was physical as much as mental, which is not a terribly controversial claim today, but at the time was unusual to align an emotion with physical symptoms and thereby elevating its significance. He also talked about how anxiety was associated with cardiovascular symptoms, with respiratory symptoms, with mental health symptoms, with other mental health symptoms. And he also linked anxiety to social change. And again, that's not an unusual argument for sociologists, but at the time was a somewhat unusual and bold claim. So he talked about the immaturity of American culture as one potential explanation for anxiety, the growth of the printing press, that we had more access to information, the electrical telegraph put us in contact with other people in a way that we couldn't be in contact before, and the social space in the United States suddenly was much narrower. So he argued that the steam train was an especially potent source of growing anxiety. The world seemed a lot smaller. And he had this wonderful quote that I'm going to bring up. I think the 21st century resonance is going to be pretty obvious, but I want to put it out there. He had specific claim about the inventions of Thomas Edison. So he argued that the experiments, inventions, and discoveries of Edison alone have made and are now making constant and exhausting drafts on the nervous forces of America and Europe, and have multiplied in very many ways and made more complex and extensive the tasks and agonies not only of practical men, but of professors and teachers and students everywhere. And so part of this is the world was becoming smaller. We were becoming more connected, and this was the source of our anxiety. But the concept of neurasthenia was short-lived, and it contained the seeds of its own demise. And so as medical historians have pointed out, the concept was too non-specific, especially in light of how medicine was evolving at the time. So the symptoms were arrayed over multiple organs and systems, including skin, joints, heart, vision. He has long lists, very capacious lists of the symptoms of neurasthenia. And even anxiety itself was sort of folded into this larger concept that eventually evolved into fatigue. So he talked about different specific fears, but ultimately emphasized a fear of everything in his words. And he cast neurasthenia itself as self-limiting, as ultimately something we shouldn't worry about. He thought neurasthenia would eventually go away as American culture evolved essentially to the point of our European counterparts. And scientific research at the time argued that neurasthenia rarely developed into something more significant. But of course, anxiety never went away, and it's useful to think about how it evolved since then. Sigmund Freud famously took up the concept much later, and anxiety itself features prominently in the history of case notes. So if you look at individual psychiatric cases over the 20th century, as some historians have done, anxiety is a very prominent symptom of those who are suffering from a variety of psychiatric disorders. So it's right there. Freud made a very direct attempt to cleave anxiety from the vestiges of neurasthenia. So he wanted to recover anxiety as a significant lexicon of distress. And in fact, he went so far to characterize anxiety as the enigma whose complete solution would cast a floodlight upon psychic life, and later as the nuclear symptom that lit all the other symptoms that a person might experience. And what was unusual about Freud is he had very obviously peculiar ideas about the origins of psychiatric disorders in general, but in his writing on anxiety, he was much more ecumenical and in fact sounded much like a sociologist at the time. And certainly his followers did much to locate anxiety in changing social arrangements, especially in the family, socioeconomic circumstance, a lot of the things we actually focus on in sociology. So Freud was obviously wrong about many things, but he wasn't necessarily wrong about the causes of anxiety or necessarily even the significance of anxiety as the nuclear symptom of lots of other disorders. And of course, anxiety came back. And so anxiety seemed to flourish again in mid-century America. And so this is when Auden wrote his famous poem, The Age of Anxiety. Rollo May wrote a very influential book about the origins of anxiety at the time. And there was a resurfacing of the psychopharmaceutical treatment of anxiety. In particular, the minor tranquilizer Miltown, which became an especially popular drug. But in the history of Miltown, you see the sort of cycles that have happened repeatedly with anxiety. As before, anxiety came to be regarded as second order to other problems. And so the advertisement here on the right, it was second order to chronic disease that you might directly treat on its own. And although Miltown was popular for a time, it was eventually criticized as a mere lifestyle drug, as a potentially dangerous drug or potentially addictive to drug. But below that surface was concern that anxiety itself never really amounted to a significant dimension of suffering, that it's not something that ought to concern us, especially not the medical enterprise. So again, anxiety rises up as a significant element of emotional suffering, only to be dismissed as something that's second order and somewhat trivial. And in fact, this got eventually codified into the DSM. So here I'm essentially talking about the work of Alan Horowitz and others, where they discuss the transition of the loss of anxiety to an age of depression. And so if you look at and compare DSM-2 and DSM-3, so DSM-3, the history of this is probably the most significant revision of the DSM, and the place of anxiety in the DSM changed a lot between DSM-2 and DSM-3. So in DSM-2, anxiety is certainly a cross-cutting theme. It appears in lots of different psychiatric disorders. It's often quite vague, but it's an element of a lot of different specific disorders. Whereas in DSM-3, it gets relegated to a single category and essentially segregated from other symptoms. It's a unique symptom. It's a unique category of disorders. It's worth talking on its own, but it's not the sort of leitmotif that was happening in DSM-2. And it's also the case that scientifically in DSM-3, mood disorders became very well represented by one specific one, that is a major depressive episode or a major depressive disorder, whereas anxiety is a much more variegated set of targets, and so there's specific phobias, social phobias. Within each of those categories, there's a variety of different sources of different phobias. So it's not represented by a single disorder, apart from generalized anxiety disorder, and that doesn't really represent all that well. And of course, at the same time was the development of Prozac, and so depression became an especially significant target of the pharmaceutical enterprise, certainly, and also the medical enterprise more generally. So whatever happened to the age of anxiety, it quickly transitioned to an age of depression. And I would argue that sociologists have contributed too to the idea or the sort of intuition that anxiety is second order. And I'm going to use some specific examples, but this is not to pick on anyone in particular. It's just to give you a sense about where anxiety fit in sort of the constellation of symptoms that we can experience. So I would say in sociology, for a long time, anxiety is everywhere. Everybody's kind of measuring it. It turns up in lots of our different studies, but it's also nowhere in particular. So one example is social class and mental illness. This is obviously a classic in our field by Hollingshead and Rich. And they had to sort of square the argument that they saw anxiety as the product of ambition, setting your sights high and maybe not be able to achieve that, but also they're finding that anxiety was much more common in the lower class than in the upper class. And so they did this by not only arguing that there's this difference between psychoses and neuroses, but having different subclasses of neuroses and arguing that only a particular type were more common in the lower class. So they argued that antisocial and immaturity reactions were more common in the lower class, whereas neuroses were more common in the upper class, although both can be characterized with anxiety. And did this sort of softening where they said character neuroses were more mixed symptoms, relatively mild, some behavioral disturbances, whereas antisocial and immaturity reactions, although related to anxiety, were characterized by the inability to maintain adult emotional balance and independence. And so sociologists have engaged in this practice where they would demonstrate that anxiety is correlated with a lot of the things we care about, but also engage in this idea that it's not terribly significant. It might be a factor of character, feature of character rather than a true psychiatric disorder. Transitioning to the modern era, anxiety is one of the critical components of the concept of non-specific psychological distress. So on the right-hand side is the familiar K6. This is in the National Health Interview Survey, among other things. There's longer versions of this instrument that have more symptoms, but anxiety is featured prominently along with symptoms of depression. But it gets folded into this general concept, and so we don't talk about feeling nervous, we don't talk about feeling restless or fidgety. Specifically, we talk about non-specific psychological distress, and occasionally go into the idea that this is the K6 is better characterized by depression anyways. And there's other things that are going on. So if you use the DSM classification system, like the National Comorbidity Survey has done, they find that anxiety disorders tend to be mild. And so it's easy in some ways to dismiss anxiety disorders relative to mood disorders. They tend not to be as disabling in terms of work loss, for example. And further, anxiety is often attached to something specific. And so in the sociology of mental health, we often talk about stress and its sort of general effects on psychological suffering. But we engage in this move where we talk about anxiety as a fear of something in particular. And so it must have a more specific origin story. Your fear of public speaking, your fear of other people, your social phobias, your specific phobias, fear of animals, and so on. We sort of think these things must be rooted in something more specific rather than the general processes that tend to concern us. And further, anxiety fits very well into the harmful dysfunction critique of Horowitz and Wakefield. That is, to the extent that we consider it a psychiatric disorder, it would have to be a normally functioning mental system that has gone awry, and it's very difficult to imagine when that system might go awry. So that critique lends itself to the idea that anxiety, certainly overdiagnosed, is not usually a real problem, whereas mood disorders are much more likely to be significant. So just to start to think about and make an argument for why anxiety is different, we'll start with the idea of comorbidity. And so generalized anxiety disorder and major depression are highly comorbid. And so this is the Venn diagram of the two from two different data sources. And obviously there's a lot of overlap. And from this, some people have argued that depression and anxiety, though very different emotionally, might be essentially the same. So what loss is there to blending these two things together? And in fact, the K6, which I just showed you, has excellent single-dimension psychometric properties, almost by design. And so we're really not losing too much if we blend those things into a single metric. But I want to first argue that scratch the surface a little bit, and these two things are very different. Anxiety and depression have very different character in terms of their evolutionary origins, their cognitive dimensions, their causes, and how they're treated in the medical sector. So I want to start to develop that argument. So I'll just give some specific examples. There's a lot of material on, a lot of research on the evolutionary dimensions of anxiety and depression. And the simple answer here is that it's much easier to make a case, an evolutionary case for anxiety than there is for depression. So depression mostly, although not perfectly, undermines fitness. Depression is very disabling. Depressed people don't have a lot of energy. It's very difficult to imagine how they would fit into an evolutionary framework. To the extent that people have made arguments along these lines, the fitness value of depression stems from how it suppresses behavior rather than motivates behavior. So it might reduce energy consumption when starvation is possible, reduces effort when persistence is unlikely to pay off, reduces aggression when you're unlikely to prevail in some competition, increases isolation when there's some risk of infectious disease, for instance. Whereas anxiety, the fitness implications are much more plain. And so an anxious response, a fear response, is very well tailored to the threat. So social anxiety, you avoid people. Startle reflex leads to quick action. And a fear of heights invokes freezing. And under all circumstances, anxiety sort of sharpens the mind. And so this has value from a fitness perspective. And even extreme anxiety, like an anxiety disorder, some have argued that that too has evolutionary origins in that a sensitive smoke detector, this is the smoke detector principle, is better than an insensitive one when that false alarm can be minimized. You don't have to worry too much about a false alarm when it comes to anxiety. You can eventually calm yourself down. So there's a very strong case for anxiety and not so much for depression. There's also research from mostly employing the Stroop test that looks at the cognitive functioning of the operation of the mind, the social psychology of people who have anxiety versus people who have depression. And as far as I can tell, there's a couple of differences that are significant. And so anxious people in the Stroop test tend to focus on very threatening words. So die, fear, infect, those are the words that use the stimuli in these studies. In depression, it's things like rain, accident, and pain. And these studies find that anxious people attend to virtually any threatening word that you put up there. So their fear is pervasive. Whereas depressed people, they attend to negative words, but mostly negative words that have some sort of personal association with them. So not all negative words. Anxiety tends to focus the attention of anxious people, whereas depression tends to diffuse it. And the anxious also critically attend to ambiguous words and interpret them as threatening. So one word that gets used here is conviction. So convictions, as in you're convicted to you have some conviction to an idea, or conviction as in a legal matter, and they tend to think about conviction as a legal matter. Depressed people don't tend to do the same sort of thing. So anxious people are often scanning their environment, looking for threats, whereas depressed people are not. And so the upshot here is that anxiety might be more potent in the mind of the anxious than depression is in the minds of the depressed. So they have different cognitive implications. And more recently, anxiety and depression are treated very differently as scientific phenotypes. That is, scientists, especially natural scientists, people who are using animal models, can get a handle on anxiety much better than they can depression. That has implications for, among other things, drug development. So anxiety fits very well into model organism studies. So fear-related behavior of humans is very similar to what you find in animals. Fear can be induced very specifically using classic conditioning. And for this reason, anxiety is more attractive, whereas depression has a variety of different symptoms, some of which cannot even be motivated very well in animal models. Things like guilt, feelings of inappropriate guilt, feelings of worthlessness. These things are essential to depression, but they're very difficult to simulate in animals, and so you get a very different kind of depression in animals relative to what you're going to find in humans. So anxiety is more attractive from the scientific design's perspective. And the most recent manifestation of this is the RDoC, which we could devote a lot of attention to. It's debatable how much influence RDoC has had on scientific practice, but the fact is that if you are trying to create a system where symptoms are real to the extent that you can show their manifestation in the mind, in the brain, anxiety fits much better in that system than does depression. So anxiety is well established, for example, in neuroimaging research. And it lends itself very well to some of the specific constructs that are now included in RDoC. So fear and impairment, apprehension and avoidance, whereas depression, although represented in RDoC, is not as well represented as anxiety. So to the extent that RDoC is the 21st century of mental health research, anxiety is better positioned than is depression. So I want to transition to some other arguments and make the case for why and what it might look like if we're entering a true age of anxiety. And so this is some more original analyses to the book. So the three essential conditions, I would say, if you're going to truly argue that it's an age of anxiety. And I would argue that most people, to the extent that they've used this language in the past, they've used it imprecisely. So it's not as if Auden, for example, was saying this is an age of anxiety and not an age of depression. And even scientists, when they claim that something is an age of anxiety, they're rarely so precise as to say it's not also an age of depression. So what would that mean to say that we're in an age of anxiety? And the first thing you would have to demonstrate that the population is primed in some way to express distress, primarily or first as anxiety. It also helps to demonstrate that patterns of social change are uniquely suited to develop anxiety rather than depression. And another facet of that is that we have a clinical enterprise that's better positioned to recognize and treat anxiety in patients that present with different psychiatric symptoms, for example. So I want to make the case for some evidence on all three of those points. So this is from data that I use in the book. It's the Collaborative Psychiatric Epidemiological Surveys. And so some of you will be familiar with this. This is a blend of the three largest psychiatric epidemiological surveys in psychiatric science. And so National Comorbidity Survey, the National Survey of Latinos and Asian Americans, and also the National Survey of American Life are blended in that. So this is data. These are numbers from that data set. So on the right-hand side is the screen positive prevalence of different disorders. So a screen positive prevalence is not that you suffer from this disorder, but that you have one or more of the critical symptoms necessary for that disorder. So for major depression, that would be depressed mood or a lack of interest or pleasure. So you recognize that from the DSM. And on the table on the right are specific anxiety disorders and specific mood disorders, and then at the bottom I have elements of comorbidity. And so if you just look at the 18 to 29 population, so this is younger folks, these are the folks who are most, where the prevalence of anxiety is the highest. About 90% of those people, 18 to 29, have at least one of the key symptoms necessary for the diagnosis of an anxiety disorder. Whereas for a mood disorder, it's only 66.3%. Now that drops as you get older, but notice that the difference between 18 to 29 and 60 and older is very small relative to what you find for a mood disorder. So even among the 60-year-olds and older who have the lowest prevalence of psychiatric disorders, over 80% have at least one of the key symptoms necessary for one of those psychiatric disorders. And the most common symptoms is significant fear. Whereas for mood disorders, it's only about half. If you go down to the bottom, more people screen positive for a pure anxiety disorder than a pure mood disorder. In fact, it's a very large difference. And so the fact is that most of us have at least one of the symptoms necessary to meet the diagnostic threshold for a specific phobia, social phobia, one of the anxiety disorders. Whereas a fair number of people in the population are not at a real risk in their lifetime for ever experiencing a mood disorder, including a major depressive episode. So we have a population where the latent risk for an anxiety disorder is much higher than it is for a mood disorder. And in fact, there's evidence that anxiety is changing over time. And so this is from a very old data set called Americans View Their Mental Health, which was collected at the University of Michigan between 1957 and 1976, so 2 different years. And there's lots that can be said about this time period. This is obviously data you wouldn't want to put out there as evidence of what's happening now, but this is an especially significant time in American history, and in fact this corresponds with the period in which we think the age of anxiety started to materialize. And if you look specifically at that data, they asked a series of questions about how happy you were, how worried you were, and also whether you ever suffered from a nervous breakdown. That's not the language you use today, but a detailed look shows that between that period, 1957 to 1976, worry increased a lot. So the percentage who worry a lot increased from 34% to 45%, whereas the percent reporting that they were not happy didn't change at all. So it was about 11%. What you see in the table is a synthetic cohort analysis. So I'm looking at intercohort versus intracohort change. And if you just focus on the middle column where there's the most significant change, so that's the percent who worry a lot, the percentages for intercohort change are much larger in general than for intracohort change. And so part of what's going on here, one of the engines of social change, is there are cohort differences. And so each new cohort, each progressive new cohort, seems to have a higher level of anxiety than the ones preceding them. And so I think that's the significant engine of social change. And there's a big change in worry during this time period. There's not such a big change in depression or unhappiness during this time period. And you find something similar in more recent data. And so this is from National Health Interview Survey, where they implement the K6, and so those 6 questions, 2 of which are anxiety, 3 of which are depression. And on the right-hand side here, on the figure, the top line are trends in anxiety symptoms, the 2 anxiety symptoms, and the bottom is the average for the trends in the 3 depression-related symptoms. And in general, especially after 2007, anxiety has been increasing more than has depressive symptoms. And so the bottom table presents analysis of that, so it looks at per year changes in these symptoms arrayed by cohort, and essentially replicates what I showed before with respect to the Americans View Their Mental Health. Anxiety is rising faster among younger people than among older people, though it's increasing for all those cohorts during that time period. And so, in general then, it seems that the population is more sensitive to anxiety than to depression. So anxiety disorders are also, if you add up the different this is not a statement that's unique to this study, but anxiety disorders are in general the most common Axis 1 psychiatric disorders. So their lifetime prevalence exceeds that for mood disorders. So the lifetime prevalence of any anxiety disorder, according to the National Comorbidity Survey and the CPAS, is about 26% among those 18 to 29, and about 16% among those 60 and older, whereas the lifetime prevalence of mood disorders is 18% and 11% respectively. So anxiety disorders, sort of universe of things you can suffer from, are much more common. And on the right-hand side are cohort differences calculated in a somewhat different way. So here I have neither type of disorder, a mood disorder but no anxiety, an anxiety disorder but no mood disorder, and both a mood and anxiety disorder. And these prevalences suggest that if you're going to suffer from one disorder, not the other, it's much more likely to be anxiety disorder than a mood disorder. And so, as a dimension of distress, anxiety is more common than our mood disorders. And although they're highly comorbid, there's a relatively large segment of the population that will only suffer from an anxiety disorder and not a mood disorder. It's also the case that anxiety disorders start much younger than mood disorders, which is important for thinking about their causes and their persistence over a lifetime. And the mean or median age of onset has been decreasing over cohorts. So here I have the mean age of onset for different cohorts, so 18 to 29 all the way up to 60 and over. And the earliest onset anxiety disorder, if you have an anxiety disorder, tends to start at the age of 9 for those 18 to 29, and about 18 for those 60 and over. Whereas for major depression, the comparable figures are 16% and 40. So if you just look at the 60 and over, that population, if they have an anxiety disorder, it starts in their teens. But if they have a mood disorder, the first onset of that mood disorder tends to be in their 40s. So this has implications for thinking about the causes of anxiety disorders, the cause of mood disorders, and it suggests that if people are going to have an anxiety disorder, often the first thing they experience is a psychiatric disorder. The first thing they experience is an anxiety disorder that may evolve into a mood disorder, but does put significant power in that initial case of fear, that initial panic, that initial phobia that you might have had. In the remainder of the book, in the different chapters, I make an argument that it's not only the case that anxiety is especially common, that the latent risk is especially high, but in fact, if you look at environmental risk factors, they tend to be more strongly correlated with anxiety than depression. And so this is a summary here on the right-hand side. This is also from the CPAS. This is looking at the probability of developing an early onset anxiety or a mood disorder. And here I'm just looking at a pure anxiety or a pure mood disorder. In other analyses, I look at comorbidity. And the total risk ranges here from 0 to 9. So these are childhood risk factors. And so these things include things like abuse, neglect, whether your mother or father had specific psychiatric disorders, whether you moved a lot. So it's a summary of those things. So it ranges from 0 to 9. And these two lines represent your risk for a mood disorder, which is on the bottom, and your risk of an anxiety disorder. And so the first thing to note is the anxiety line is higher than the mood line. And also the slope is significantly larger for anxiety than it is for a mood disorder. These things increase your risk of developing depression, but it's much more likely that you're going to develop anxiety. And in fact, the relationship is stronger for anxiety than it is for mood disorders. And in fact, a lot of these risk factors have been growing over time, so that younger cohorts are at a higher risk, have a higher total risk score than do older cohorts. And so this not only comports with a sort of understanding about the relative sensitivity of these things, but also some of the cohort differences in anxiety that we see. There's also some specific risk factors that we talk a lot about these days that have special relevance to anxiety. So one concept that gets used a lot is status anxiety. And status anxiety is, although a colloquial term, is remarkably precise, it would seem, in terms of its emotional consequences. And so this is a regression model of the relationship between where you place yourself on the ladder. So the ladder is a familiar measure of status, and so it asks yourself to put an X on the rung corresponding to where you think you sit in your community in the US more generally. And so we know that people tend to put themselves a little bit above the midpoint. And in this study, I correlate those. I do a regression model where I use that to predict depression and predict anxiety. And it turns out that the latter has a much stronger relationship with anxiety than with depression, and also that it has a much stronger relationship with both of those things relative to your income. And here it's deciles to make it comparable. And moreover, it turns out that young people seem to be especially vulnerable, not necessarily because where they place themselves on that ladder, and so there's lots of young people who place themselves quite high, but rather the departure between where they place themselves and where they ought to be relative to their education and their income. And so the third column of numbers here expresses the difference between your rank and your expected rank based on your objective status. And older people put themselves higher than you would expect based on those predictors, and younger people put themselves lower than you would based on those objective features. And so the risk of status anxiety, in other words, is stronger in younger people than in older people, which again comports with the rising tide of anxiety among younger people, and also these cohort differences that we observe. Of course, the other thing that gets a lot of attention is what's happening with Facebook and our social relationships. And here I would argue that some of the trends in anxiety really are much more slow moving than the sort of specific claim about social media might imply. And there's lots of evidence that the prevalence of a secure attachment style, so this is an older concept attached to Bowlby in particular, this is not your current relationships necessarily, but your general approach to social relationships and your confidence in other people, for example. And so the clear distinction, the most important distinction is between a secure attachment style and an insecure one. So on the bottom, it shows a study that looked at college students over time. This is not my work, but the top line shows the prevalence of an insecure attachment style. So either you're preoccupied with relationships, you're dismissing of them, you're fearful of other people. In studies of college cohorts, that insecure attachment style has been increasing over time. And in fact, I find that in the CPES as well, so that older folks, those 60 and older, are much more likely to have a secure attachment style relative to younger people. So 70% relative to 81%. Younger people are much more dismissing, for example, of social relationships than are older people. The analysis suggests that although lots of things with our relationships haven't changed over time, so time spent with friends, arguing with friends hasn't changed all that much, there's a very strong interaction. So you have a cohort that's increasingly insecure in their attachments, and when you have that insecure attachment style, your amount of support that you can derive from your friends tends to decrease. And so conflict, for example, has a much stronger relationship with anxiety among those who have an insecure attachment style. So imagine cohorts that are changing slowly over time in combination with an environment that's robust, for example, for social comparisons and all the other things that we associate with social media. And the final point that I would make is that it's not only that anxiety seems to be increasing between cohorts, but also that we have a clinical system that's much more likely to recognize it. And so you can think about the Milltown era as a sort of aberrant area that was a little bit short-lived, but if you look at what physicians are prescribing today, what they're seeing in their clinical practice, anxiety seems to be on the rise. And so this is data from the National Ambulatory Medical Care Survey. So this is data that looks at visits to a physician, general medical practice. And as part of that, they asked the physician to record what their patient presented, what symptoms, and also what diagnosis they made. So we have two sides of the equation here. And the figure on the right presents on the top the proportion of visits involving mental health that involve the symptoms of anxiety or depression. And the bottom is the diagnosis that you rendered in light of the symptom presentation. As we know in general, mental health symptoms are often overlooked. And so if you go to a doctor's office and you're presenting with the symptoms of cancer or something else, that's more likely to get much more attention. But as you can see from the top figure, more people are presenting the symptoms of anxiety. So that's increased since 2009. And especially in the recent period, in the recent analysis, patients are much more likely to walk out with a diagnosis of anxiety relative to depression. The other thing I do is to situate these symptoms in the universe of other things that you can present at your physician's visit. And I find that physicians are increasingly less likely to discount anxiety. They don't dismiss it as much as they used to. And so the relationship between you presenting the symptoms of anxiety and you walking out with a minor tranquilizer or at least a diagnosis of some sort of anxiety problem has increased over time. So that claim of being anxious is assuming much more significance in clinical encounters. It's not being dismissed as much as it was in the past. And in fact, physical symptoms are not completely overshadowing anxiety symptoms in the way that they might have in the past. And so as a therapeutic target, as something physicians are aware of, it's much more relevant than it was in the past. And so this too is consistent with the idea that we're entering an age of anxiety. Okay, so I'll close with this. These are the more unusual claims. I would just summarize by saying anxiety is common. Not necessarily anxiety disorders, but just the basic premise, the basic feeling of being anxious is very common, almost to the point of being universal. Virtually everybody, 80 to 90%, is vulnerable to an anxiety disorder as classified in the DSM, even if that doesn't come to fruition, obviously. Anxiety is often the initial and early response to social change, to stress in your life, especially among younger people. Anxiety tends to be chronic, though it can also be treated episodically in a way that I think is attractive to clinicians and, in fact, to patients. And it lends itself to a variety of treatment modalities, although I haven't gotten into it here. Schools, for example, are increasingly implementing cognitive behavioral therapy treatments in a sort of broadcast fashion to students, recognizing that it's serious and that you don't actually need to target people who are at any sort of specific risk. And so anxiety also has that resonance in institutional settings. And I would go so far as to say, and the right-hand figure here represents that a little bit, that anxiety is now the sort of preferred language for talking about stress. So the poster here is it stress or anxiety? Provides you a little bit of information. This is from the National Institute of Mental Health on whether it could be either of those things, and it shows there's obviously some overlap. But I think it's meaningful that it's not expressed in terms of is this depression or stress or any other psychiatric disorder. The language here is it stress or anxiety in particular. So I think this betrays something significant, maybe perhaps a sea change in how we talk about psychiatric distress and the symptoms we tend to invoke. I think anxiety is assuming renewed significance. It's much less likely to be disregarded than it was in the past, and it's probably taken more seriously than it was certainly in the middle part of the century or early part of the 19th century. So those are the conditions, I would argue, that make mid-20th century here perhaps especially ripe to be an age of anxiety.
Thank you so much, Jason and Dr. Schnicker. That was a fantastic presentation, and I imagine that we all have so many questions for you. But before turning that over to the audience, we have a special guest here to provide a discussion of your talk. So I am delighted to introduce Dr. Blair Wheaton, who is a distinguished professor of sociology at the University of Toronto, the St. George campus. Dr. Wheaton is a leader in the sociology of mental health. He was the very first recipient, actually, of the prestigious Leonard Perlin Award for distinguished contributions of the sociology of mental health in 2000. This was an award from the American Sociological Association Mental Health Section. His ideas on stress, stressors, and distress have fundamentally shaped the discipline. His research continues to emphasize how both time and context combine to influence experiences of mental health. So with that introduction, I would like to say, Dr. Wheaton, we are delighted to have you here, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Marissa. Everyone hear me okay? Yeah?
Okay, try again.
I see. Can everyone hear me okay?
We can reasonably hear you okay. There's a little bit of a background echo, so if you want to just make sure that all of your students who are attending have muted their microphones.
Everyone's got, everything's off here?
Yeah, we can hear you well now. Okay, great.
Okay. I don't want to get into the echo part of this, so I'm going to show you my screen in a minute here. Where am I sharing the screen, Marissa? Sorry. Right. Sorry.
Look at the very bottom of your screen, and there's three icons there. The second icon says
okay.
Screen. Okay. And then you should have a box pop up that asks you which screen you want to share.
Can you see that? Oh, sorry.
Go to the window, and then you want your PowerPoint window.
Just a sec. This is. Hold on, I don't want to. Okay. Thank you. Okay, everyone can see that?
Yes, we can, but we cannot see. So can you go start from beginning?
Yep.
Perfect.
Everyone's got that? Okay. Just let me know if there's a problem. So the name of my response is In Defense of Depression, Jason, which you'll understand. I think we'll find many common points in what I have to say, and I don't think that's uncommon for your work and my work. So I want to emphasize some of the important overlaps in what you've achieved in this book and what the area in general needs at this point in history. So I have to say, in defense of depression and anger, because that's one of my points going forward here. So, like Jason, I see a lot of history of the implicit use of anxiety in sociological theory. I point out some different contact points here. If you read Marx's theory of alienation, it actually uses the word misery. The worker feels misery when alienated from the means of production, which we can translate into depression. Recent arguments about Durkheim's suicide basically argue that depression and anxiety are mediational vehicles for egoistic suicide, and anger is a vehicle for anomic suicide. In other words, there has been work in sociological theory recently that has inserted the concepts of mental health into the classic Durkheimian argument explicitly. And I think mid-20th century theory in sociology was very much concerned about anxiety implicitly. That is, change was seen as threat, from the growing chaos of cities to the spread of anomie, normlessness, and isolation. I note three different theoretical perspectives in the mid-20th century here that basically, without saying so, between the lines, did talk about anxiety. Louis Wirth's book on urban areas and the effects of de-individuation in urban areas, resulting in isolation, loss of self, segmentation of social life into distinct roles, etc. David Reisman's famous Lonely Crowd, in which he described the modern turn as a transition from inner to other directedness, where one's identity depended on the reactions and practices of others, which, if you just follow that shift, is probably an input to anxiety as well. And then the Mertonian theory of structural strain, emphasizing the disjunction between desired goals and available means to achieve goals, which later on became, I think, a definitional component of chronic stress in our area. So I'm going to quote myself in that Perlin Award article in 2001, where I got to write the sentence, mental health is everyone's ultimate dependent variable. And Bruce Link always reminds me of that sentence with some amusement, but I've hung on to it ever since then, because I think basically what I'm arguing is that much of sociology and social science emanates from an implicit concern for the emotional well-being of people in disadvantaged situations. So that, despite that concern for emotional well-being and the examples at the bottom of this slide, there's much work that discusses well-being without measuring it. That first bullet point about child well-being is from a book in economics, in which the concept of child well-being is discussed via losses to educational achievement, growth of single-parent families, financial insecurities, and never does anyone ever measure well-being explicitly. That is a common theme in much of the rest of social science and sociology. So I think this book sits in the context of two histories then. The invisible but present issue of mental health in classic sociological work, which emphasizes threat and change, and thus indirectly anxiety. And then the classic works, which Jason just referred to, that define this area through the mid-20th century. Ferris and Dunham, Mental Illness in Urban Areas, about Chicago in the 1930s. Stauffer's famous book, The American Soldier. Hollingshead and Redlich, which was mentioned and reviewed by Jason. Langner and Michael's study of Manhattan in the 1960s, and Dornwend. There was a march of major books, often talking about social inequalities and its relationship to mental health through the 1970s. I think there are two themes in these works: status differentials and social inequalities on the one hand, and social change as threat on the other. Collectively, what we share as an area, compared to, for example, maybe psychology and maybe psychiatry, is that we see the madness as in the environment, not in the people. So, I think Unnerved reflects both classic traditions, but focuses on mental health explicitly, which we need to do, and returns to what I think is, and Jason seems to think, is an almost forgotten defining theme of this area, which is social change. After 1980, there were fewer books articulating a comprehensive perspective on the explanation of mental health disparities. Basically, post-1980, simplified, is a history of research articles and chapters, and the books focused on the critique of psychiatry and its concepts. So I think we need more of this kind of ambitious thinking about the links between social environments and mental health in this kind of form. I also think the interdisciplinary conversation in this book is very, very important. In a sense, the strength of the sociology of mental health in the last 40 years has somewhat isolated it from the need to have conversations across disciplines. I come from an era of the earlier training programs that required training in sociology and epidemiology of all students. And if we had the funding, I would support going back to that. So in the tension between the study of status versus change, recent history does suggest status has taken up much of the space, which is counterbalanced somewhat by this book. I think the core argument here is important to its contribution. Change, breeding threat, leading to stress, and then leading to anxiety first. And I emphasize first because I think that's consistent with Jason's argument here. I really would advocate anyone who has never read a book on mental health read this book anyway, because there is a lot to learn about recent social change in this book. It was so full of interesting mapping of social changes in the last 30 or 40 years. And I have to say, I really learned a lot just from that aspect of the book. It also relies on a strong empirical foundation to make its case. This is based on the growth of data on mental health over the last 50 years. And as I have been quoted as saying, let's remember, evidence is all we have to save us from theory. So, I think the components of social change discussed here are very important, but I also think there are other components I want to return to. I want to talk about a complementary perspective that doesn't take issue with the book, but sort of fills in another hypothesis which we could consider. In the work in stratification, the contrast was between the effects of status versus change, and there was much work in the 1980s to resolve mobility versus status effects across generations. So one complementary hypothesis, Jason, I'm speaking to you, I guess, directly about this, is that social change impacts anxiety first, but stable social status inequalities impact depression more. And a sequence hypothesis, which I think you articulated very clearly here today, is that anxiety is the first response to threat, but if not resolved, or the threat is uncontrollable, or it just persists, then it grows into depression. That would be consistent with your findings about comorbidity. So you describe the difference in the phenomenology of anxiety and depression here, and it's very important. I don't think I need to elaborate this point too much. But the interesting thing about looking at it as a sequence of responses is that I would insert anger in the middle. That is, if anxiety is an early response to threat, that is standing for awareness and expectation of threat, anger is an understandable second stage of fighting back, which if it does not resolve the issue, the stress, the threat does not go away, leads to depression. And one of the defining qualities of depression is giving up. So it is a very different phenomenology than anxiety. So stable causes represent unsolvable problems in people's lives. So the rise in depression as a response to stable causes makes sense to me. So my hypothesis here is depression is more a response to structurally driven inequalities, and anxiety more a response to disruption of the normal. When you look at other examples you could use that complement and support the book, you could look at Patricia Louis and my article in the American Journal of Epidemiology in 2018, which was about cohort change in anxiety and depression in cohorts of Black and white adolescent Americans. And one table from that article is shown here, in which if you go across from the oldest through the middle to the youngest cohort, you see an increased risk of both mood disorders and anxiety disorders. This is basically the black-white difference over those cohorts. And so this introduces an issue which I think I would encourage more elaboration of what the book focuses on, which is the differential effects of social change landing on certain populations. In that circled finding in the bottom right, we actually see in the youngest cohort an increased risk of anxiety disorder among Black adolescents by the time we get to that youngest group. So one thing I did just for fun in preparing this was to actually look at something I think is missing in the book, but I'm curious about, which is how the classic social status inputs to mental health are related to depression and anxiety. So looking at gender, SES, marital status, and age, are these social factors related to anxiety and depression over time? Do they affect anxiety more, the same, or less than depression? So I was inspired by the analysis of the Americans View Their Mental Health idea. It gave me an idea, so I wanted to thank Jason for that idea, which is that I could look at the effects of status differentials on anxiety and depression over a 20-year period in Toronto using two data sets with the same variables, measured the same way, and a random sample of adults. The 1990 Toronto longitudinal study that Jay Turner and I did, and then in 2010, the Toronto neighborhood study that Pat Ocampo and I did. So we're going to look at some findings from that because it speaks not to the issue with regard to depression and anxiety disorder, but something I'm usually very concerned about in addition, which is how the whole gradient of depression and anxiety works in the population. So this is the 1990 results, and everything here is scaled the same way. There are a few differences in the size of these coefficients for depression versus anxiety. They're mostly insignificantly different. It's interesting, but not sort of beyond the book because of the uniqueness of immigration in Toronto and Canada in general, that the effects of being foreign-born have stronger effects on reducing anxiety than they do on reducing depression. But the one finding I noticed that's important is the larger effect of household income on reducing depression relative to anxiety. That was significantly different. So we have to remember that's one of the core findings in the history of this area in terms of social class differences in mental health. By 2010, the situation is a little different. And if anything, the linkages between these classic inputs to mental health disparities is getting stronger for depression relative to anxiety because there are now more cases in which there's a stronger effect on depression than on anxiety. The effect of household income is still stronger, but also the effects of divorced and never married marital status relative to married are now also significantly higher on depression than anxiety in this 20-year period. I have to also point out, I haven't been able yet, but I'm going to compare the cross-time changes following the logic of what Jason did in the book. And I just want to, if you want to discuss this, I got fascinated by the fact that if you look at the female versus male differences in depression and anxiety in 1990 compared to 2010, they're about half the size. So I do want to look at that further. So I've described those tables. We don't need to go over them again. I think the results are rather equivocal about who has the larger or the closest association with the classic social status differentials. But overall, I think when we look at those differences, I do think the results suggest separation is a good idea. But not because anxiety dominates, just because we find unique inputs to each. I also tested different factor models because one thing I didn't say, and I should say, is that one thing about the trauma studies is we had full measures of anxiety and depression, separate measures. We didn't have to pull apart distress measures. That's rather unique and maybe one of the advantages of community studies. So in a confirmatory factor model from the more recent study, I'll report that depression and anxiety are correlated 0.87. That's a confirmatory model. The worst fit in these models happens because of missing parameters for some depression items as measures of anxiety and some anxiety items as measures of depression. But again, the two-factor model fits better, so it does support the idea of separation. Jason talks at length in the book and here today as well about the issue of seriousness. Basically, what are the life consequences of anxiety versus depression? It's not mentioned explicitly, but we should be reminded of the sort of functional anxiety model in psychology, where up to a threshold of anxiety is seen as activation, motivation, increased attention, and focus. And also, I think we should think about anxiety as a much more diverse category than depression. That's also been commented on. And I do wonder about sort of the role phobias take in this overall heterogeneity within the anxiety category in terms of making it a more prevalent disorder than depression. So a number of studies are cited here you can read over that talk about the evidence of impairment. Effects of these disorders on schooling are pretty equal. Depression has serious effects on lost work days. Forthofer suggests that depression has a stronger effect on reducing the risk, leads to a reduced risk of on-time marriage, and so marriage per se. More recent work shows effects of depression on impaired performance at work almost 3 times higher than anxiety. Breslau, the same Breslau that did work earlier on this, that shows the effects of depression are more significant in predicting no transition to marriage relative to anxiety disorders. So I think consistent with what the book says, there is pretty good evidence that in some areas, depression implies more life impairments. So without going through those details, there's about 6 studies I looked at. There is the issue of the fact that there's impairment due to both, but I think slightly better better evidence for depression. So what is missing here in the final comments I want to make? One, I think, is anger. It's rarely measured separately, and yet I think it is probably one of the more plausible ideas in terms of a growing historical profile in terms of mental health. So I looked at the inputs to anger in the 2010 study, and I just wanted to note that the inputs are somewhat different than for depression and anxiety, suggesting it is a somewhat separate issue. There are stronger effects of education on reducing anger compared to either depression or anxiety, and much weaker effects of income. So that switch in the relevance of two components of SES again argues for separation, as the book does, but it also argues for the importance of some missing components in understanding social change. The second thing that's missing, I think, is some components of the stressed universe. These things are not necessarily measured in many studies, but they were measured in the Toronto studies, as many people know. I do think the omission of chronic stress is unfortunate. So I looked at those in 1990, and to my surprise, but consistent with the thesis in the book, chronic stress actually has a stronger effect on anxiety than depression in the 1990 data, and it has reversed by 2010. So that both life events and chronic stress have stronger effects in 2010 after this period of social change compared to 1990. Something's happened there. Something has changed. Finally, there's the issue of mastery, sense of control, or instrumentalism. I think there's strong and consistent evidence for the role of beliefs in control in mental health outcomes. It's not often measured in national data or in older surveys, but it was included in both the 1990 and 2010 survey. So the advantage here is actually distinct measures, again, of depression and anxiety. I think it's important because many believe that this factor is more fundamental than social support even, because you carry it with you. It's unconditional. You don't have to go find it and seek it out and verify that it's there. And it depends on beliefs, not on action. So I did the same thing with mastery in 1990 and 2010. They have exactly the same effects in 1990. But by 2010, again, mastery has a stronger effect on depression than it does on anxiety. So, I may not have time for all the questions and comments along the way. I think this book makes a really good case for the generic role of anxiety in understanding social change. It has been hypothesized to be sort of the prominent fallout of changes and threat in the population through a century and a half. It's much like using stress to explain the cause of all health problems when you really don't know the cause. The comorbidity issue is important. The issue will become, do we miss anything by studying distress, which is the combination of depression and anxiety? So that's a big question, and it's answered in various ways in the book. But I'm talking about scale measures of depression and anxiety per se. I mentioned mastery. I don't think we need to go further with that. There's the issue of the differential stability, which the book says claim sort of that anxiety sustains itself while depression needs input to persist is interesting in the book. But my question for Jason about this is, what is this actually based on? How extensive is that evidence? And what is the answer for anxiety versus depression as gradients, not disorders? I have to say it would surprise me greatly if generic forms of anxiety were more stable over time. The prevalence issue I referred to because I think phobias somewhat skew the comparison when they are mild and less debilitating. Well, there's the age period cohort issue, which I won't raise. Some of the comparisons in the book talk about early age of onset for anxiety versus depression, but if depression has a typically later age of onset, then I wondered whether or not this is a fair test of the associations with depression, because part of the range of its first onset is so wide. The part on family changes, not discussed here today, I thought was really interesting. I'd like to know what the intercohort change overall in stress exposure in children's lives is, all things considered. That would be a wonderful further issue to pursue. And in the book, I think there are many issues with regard to religion. I list some in bullet points here you can read over. I do think the issue of postmodern nihilism requires a major discussion. I think the role of faith as a replacement for personal instrumentalism requires some, but I also want to say every one of these chapters is really masterful at weighing the counteracting forces at work, and including this chapter. But it did raise a lot of interesting questions. I don't think science and rationality is innocent, although it seemed like that was claimed at one point in the book. For me, it looks like credible evidence for claims is in decline. Accusations equal proof. Truth is relative and personal, and expertise is seen as a sham, a Wizard of Oz game. This in itself could affect changes in anxiety in conjunction with the decline of traditional institutions. So, other social changes in my last comments here. In 2001, in that article, I basically also was talking about what kinds of social changes may be influencing the overall prevalence of mental health problems going forward. So I asked, what if a significant change in the importance of social context has occurred at the level of interpersonal reality? Knowing that Jason is also trained in social psych like I was in graduate school, I think this is an important focus because it's kind of the middle stage social context between individual lives and the larger social context. So my three ideas at the time were that what we were about to witness was an increase in the rate of regulation of daily interaction, the spread of mistrust, and an increase in prevalence of early and easy labeling. And in some, we evolved somehow from an innocent until proven guilty interpersonal model to a guilty until proven innocent. An innocent until proven guilty interpersonal model to a guilty until proven innocent interpersonal model. So, in thinking about this further, in terms of the abstract issues in social change, which I think become important although we can't measure them easily, I went back to Goffman, in which, in the presentation of self, he talks about the actor and the audience, or the listener or the observer, who negotiated an understanding of the current micro-reality every day. Today, I think the intentions of the actor, the meanings to the actor, and the meanings to the observer are treated as separate realities, with no required meeting point. Potentially, this means the actor is constantly aware of the reinterpretation of behavior in other terms, but cannot control those terms. Basically, the actor has lost control. The interpretation of the other dominates relative to Goffman's time. So the predictable result, if that theoretical premise is true, is increased anxiety and anger in the experience of day-to-day life. The final issue is the attack on reason generalized. Evidence is in increasing conflict with beliefs and experience, or contested by experience. And the question is what wins? I believe that more often experience wins these days relative to 40 years ago, and when evidence used to win more often. My overview of future research all says one thing, which is that I really encourage all the young people involved in this and those in the middle stages of their career to really consider important cohort studies of mental health that need to be updated. We need another NCSR effort. We do need to study anxiety and depression separately more often in research. We do need to kind of get more concerned about the content differences of different distress scales, which are floating around in thousands of articles. And I actually think we also need to really take seriously the international generalizability of these social changes and other causes of the rise of anxiety if it exists. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Blair. I appreciate your response, and as always, you went above and beyond and did analyses with your own data in order to show evidence for your points. So I think that is very remarkable, and I hope that has generated some ideas for new papers in your mind as well. Of course, we are going to give Jason an opportunity to respond to your question and comments, obviously. It sort of seems as though he might have to write another book in order to cover all the range of topics and suggestions. But Jason, I'll hand that over to you, and then from that point, we'll go to the floor and ask some questions of the audience.
Yeah, great. I'll want to leave plenty of time for that. So thanks, Blair, for your comments. I mean, these are really helpful. Thanks for your analyses. Obviously, wanted some data, but your other comments for which you didn't have data are just as useful. I guess a couple ways to respond here. One, as you know, this was an attempt that is, as you pointed out, is very old school to think about social change as contributing to mental health research. I mean, that was an explicit goal here. And I think part of it was, my thinking is that there's a whole literature in the social sciences and sociology about religious change and what's actually changing, what's not, the rise of the nuns, change in belief versus change in practice, rising income inequality. And although they talk about well-being, certainly in that literature, that connection isn't made. So that was, I'm glad that came through. It's obviously in the title, but I was really trying to engage with that research and thinking about what specifically is changing, what might not be. To that point, I think your point about the rise in mistrust is really interesting, and the rise in sort of the foundations we have of rationality and so on. I tried to put all that through the attachment style analysis, in that I thought that was sort of the sharpest edge for thinking about how general mistrust of other people would operate through your social relationships. And I think one of the arguments I tried to make is that whatever else is going on now with respect to social media, Facebook, and so on, a lot of these changes were in place in the 60s, 70s, and going forward. So we need to think about sort of these slower changes. And the same is true of the family. So I have a chapter, I didn't talk too much about that. Religion as well. A lot of these things, there's a focus on presenteeism, just thinking about what's happening right now in the New York Times and trying to think about what the implications are for health and so on. But a lot of these shifts are glacial, and our risk has just been rising sort of steadily. So that was one of the arguments I was trying to make. I like the idea of this sort of sequence of anxiety, anger, and depression. And so you're part of what I was arguing with about what depression needs to thrive versus what anxiety needs to thrive was the simple fact that I think is underappreciated, which is that anxiety disorders tend to be chronic. The chronicity, at least as we calculate it in things like the NCSR, is a little bit higher than it is for depression. And that also gets to the issue of where phobias fit in. You're correct. I mean, there are a lot of simple phobias out there that boost that prevalence. But I think, in my understanding, that some of those phobias, like of snakes and animals and planes and all the things like my 9-year-old fears, the reason those are significant is they often explode into other things. And so it's true that phobias tend not to be terribly disabling, but I think it's mostly driven by the fact that people with simple phobias avoid the thing that they fear the most, and they're pretty good at it. But that doesn't make a phobia, insignificant, especially if it's correlated with these other things like generalized anxiety disorder and other things that we care about. So yes, I think phobias play some role in elevating that prevalence. I don't know if that diminishes its significance. I really like this sequence of anxiety, anger, depression, which honestly I hadn't thought about. That your sort of unresolved anxiety would progress in depression. And you're correct that there's a relationship between early anxiety and later depression. It's a very strong one. We don't really know, I think, what's going on in that path in between. And to put anger in there, I think, is really interesting because it's a nice psychological foundation for thinking about that. I would say most of the research now is dominated on, well, what are the genes that trigger both anxiety and depression? So I like how you're thinking about that. And it'd be interesting to see, in the 10 to 20 year gap between the onset of anxiety disorder and depression, what happens socially and environmentally with you that leads to that. So I like that as well. And to the same point on the dynamics, so status versus change. Yes, Absolutely. I think, there's a sort of social mobility story here that to me got neglected because I was thinking sort of period changes, for example, when I was talking about income inequality. Status differentials, I was focused on what you have now rather than how you progressed here. I think that's important. I do think there's probably, there's some issues in thinking about the endogeneity of this because your anxiety is almost certainly going to start before you finish even high school, and thinking about its implications for your social mobility in a way that depression is not. Depression is more likely to be an output of that thing, and anxiety is more likely to be an input. So I think there's some complexities here as well, but I certainly like how you're thinking about that. And then I guess I would just close with what the argument I was trying to make with respect to science and rationality was really that our own experience of mental health is not just born by our personal environments or social environments. There's this larger scientific environment that's sort of setting the soil for how we experience these things. And my read of this is that anxiety is just really, really tractable to pharmaceutical companies who are trying to develop drugs. It's really tractable to people involved with animal models, natural scientists. It's really tractable for people who are interested in what's going on inside the brain. And it's not as if your average person is thinking about those things, but it does become the sort of language for what we think is a real expression of distress, or what we think is really going on in the mind. When the science is producing a lot of that, and sort of when depression remains at the side as sort of this complex phenotype that's really hard to get a purchase on, I think eventually that does trickle down to how physicians are prescribing and how psychiatrists are making diagnosis. And I would say in the 21st century, we're sort of seeing some of those things at least come to fruition, and anxiety suddenly becomes more a focus of those efforts. So that was sort of the argument I was trying to make with that point.
Thank you so much for that response. And Blair, I imagine that you have a response to the response, but we really do want to open it up to the floor now. And so I have two questions that are already coming through. And so the first is from Scott Sheeman, and we are going to, I guess I should say, Dr. Scott Sheeman from the University of Toronto. He's going to make his way actually up to the stage. And there he is. I can see his icon moving. So now, Scott, you are on the platform. If you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, that would be great.
Oh my God, I feel like I'm flashing back to playing Donkey Kong or Pac-Man, just ready to gobble up. On my Commodore 64 back in the
It's Super Mario, Scott.
Isn't it great? This is so much more entertaining than just a standard Zoom conference.
I think I might have nightmares about this tonight. So congratulations, Jason, on a great achievement. I really I haven't read the book. I'm just going to order it after this talk. I really look forward to reading it. And great discussion, Blair. I know we're running out of time, so I'll just be really brief. Something you said really got me thinking when you were talking about status. I was just thinking back to Len Perlin and I used to talk quite a bit about the concept of mattering. I think Morris Rosenberg was instrumental in developing that, and then he worked on it with Len. And I remember Len would say to me, just imagine a scenario where somebody feels like they just don't matter to anyone else. And I got thinking about that because I feel like social change now, especially with social media, is there's almost kind of a culture of mattering through kind of narcissism. So the social media through, you post on Instagram what you had for lunch, as if anybody really cares about that. But I imagine almost kind of what if Len were around and, he would say imagine a world where somebody doesn't get any likes or doesn't get any views. And I wonder about whether, we have these concepts of worthlessness and value, and status isn't just about money. It's about being recognized and being valued and esteemed. And I almost wonder what your take is on kind of sure, narcissism is a personality thing, but I wonder if we've kind of created a structure that just pushes in such a different way that to matter, it almost has changed it into kind of this broad culture of narcissism, where we used to get value from kind of social roles and the rewards that we got in social roles and institutions like religion. And as those kind of fall by the wayside and we're left with Instagram and God help us, Twitter and these other things, I mean, what's your impression of that? This kind of notion of kind of a rise of narcissism. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And just as a side note, I mean, some of us grew up in the 8-bit video game era, and I think this is 16-bit video game era, so even this seems sort of modern to me. Scott, so, there was this famous book in the 1970s, The Culture of Narcissism. So narcissism has sort of been around for a while, and people have been, I think, progressively saying people are becoming more narcissistic. I'm not sure if that's true, but I think you're spot on that the social media, and Facebook knows this, they've done internal research on this, they know how miserable their users are. Instagram knows this as well. I think the one issue is that it lends itself not only to trying to seek approval from people you hardly know, maybe, but there's this quantification and this metric system that's just was not part of what earlier cohorts experienced. And so it becomes very quick to get it. I mean, it becomes a quick fix, and you know very quickly if you succeeded or failed. And the opportunity to see other people and how they're doing increases a lot. And so I don't want to, I wouldn't downplay that at all. It's especially significant, I think, especially younger people. I mean, the thing I emphasize in the book is there's other things going on that are much deeper and longer than what Facebook, that's very much a 21st century thing. But I think it's you're trying to get satisfaction through something that I wouldn't say is superficial. I don't think it's necessarily wrong that people engage with these systems, but your success or failure is much quicker to realize, and it's much more dependent on people for whom you have no other role to. So I think that's correct as well. So I think there's facets to it. I think it's definitely contributing. I think it's probably, it's probably it's something that's really only prominent probably, especially in the last 10 years or so. We probably need to step a little bit back, but I certainly think it's relevant.
Thank you so much, Scott, for that question, and Jason for your answer. I would now like to invite Melissa Milkey to the stage to ask her question. Feel free to enter onto one of the microphone icons, Melissa, and then unmute yourself, please. You're almost there. There you go.
Hi, can you see me? Okay. Jason, thanks so much. This is really an amazing talk, and Blair, too, insightful as always. I'm really excited to see the book. You mentioned a few times, young people, and I'm really interested in thinking of the long progression also of ADHD and, kind of aligned anxiety, where you see this really massive increase starting really in the 1980s. At the same time, you're seeing anxieties among, like, say, mothers, right? They went from being the depressed homemaker to the over anxious, second shift mom who also is concerned about increasing inequalities, right, in this concerted cultivation. So I'm thinking just about the life course and the really interesting thing about anxiety maybe potentially becoming depression. I wonder if you talk about that at all or have thought about the alignment, which is a really structural thing as well, with increased standardized testing in schools, no recess, kinds of things that make kids, not sit still, and so on. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that's part of the rise of ADHD. I mean, to the extent that I focus on childhood causes, I focused a lot about changes in the family. And again, that aligns with some of these longer trends that I'm interested in. And, there the picture is it's quite complicated. The situation, lots of things have improved over the 20th century. I mean, that's sort of a paradox. And I think to Blair's point, there is still in a lot of mental health research and a lot of the stuff that I take on, a focus on thinking about what's happening when you're younger. And so that mother who's or that father who's really stressed for time, it's actually in the sort of the surveys that we have, it's sort of difficult to get a a picture about what's going on there. You kind of have to do special things to figure out their work schedule, for example, and how how spontaneous it is, for example. So I think that's certainly part of an issue. Academic pressures, that evidence to me is really quite clear. I mean, if you just use like seasonal variation, what happens with prescribing in school year versus the summer, it's very clear that part of that's what's going on there. I would just sort of fold that into this concept of status. It's hard to maintain that status. It takes more effort than it did before. It's much more temporary if you're going to have it at all. I mean, I think the departure that I showed between your status that you report and what you ought to report based on your objective characteristics is probably diagnostic. It's revealing this sort of tenuousness. And so, I mean, that's the theme I would emphasize. It's this tenuous attachment to whatever status that you have that's going to produce anxiety, and I think that's partly where that's coming from.
Right. Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Melissa. To continue with just, I think, one last question, we are going to ask Allison Van to come to the stage. She's the executive director for Spark, one of our centers through McMaster Faculty of Social Sciences. So Allison, if you want to come to the stage and step on to one of the icons to ask your question.
Allison may need to go out and come back in. She's on the side, it looks like.
Oh, is she?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to then instead, she did tell me her question here, and so maybe what I'll do just for the sake of time is go up to what she was asking. So she says here, one of the hypotheses associated with mindfulness-based practices is the significance of speed and reaction times for emotional dysregulation, and the emphasis on being with, quote-unquote, being with experiences that may trigger depression, anxiety, or anger. How, if at all, might these ideas fit with the discussion here?
So mindfulness, to the extent that I talk about it in the book or I thought about it, I kind of categorize this as, one of the tools that schools have increasingly used to encourage sort of emotional fluidity or emotional intelligence among students. And I think there's been a pervasive increase in that. You see it in grade schools. A lot of it is broadcast, and so it's not targeted to students who are at any particular risk for a psychiatric disorder. And I think a lot of that is focused on anxiety in particular, so it's calming your first instinct to be fearful about this exam and doing the things that are going to sort of reduce your anxiety, improve your test performance, and so on. So, and I think there's a lot of evidence that mindfulness works, and it's a good thing. So I'm not critiquing that, but I do think it's part and parcel to this idea that anxiety is especially common among young people. It undermines their school performance. It's something the institution can address. We can do that to make their lives better. And it probably, my sense is a lot of cognitive behavioral therapy or things of that sort work quite well for lots of anxiety, maybe not as much for depression. So, I guess I would think about it as, consistent with the argument that as a clinical target, at least, anxiety or things like anxiety have special resonance in the present moment in lots of different institutions, including in schools.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I am also conscious of time, and I know that we are running a bit over. And so I would invite Jason, Blair, if you have any final words. Otherwise, I will just, I think move into closing remarks for the symposium. Okay, well, thank you so much, and I want to thank all the attendees. That was a great discussion, by the way, and such a special feature, and so fortunate for us to have both you, Jason and Blair, join us. And I think what I want to just end with is the hope that, and the recognition that this was in support of the unveiling of ARMS, or the Institute for Advanced Research on Mental Health in Society that we hope to develop further at McMaster University in collaboration with other neighboring institutes. Our goal is really to put a spotlight on some of the amazing work that's going on in mental health in terms of social science perspectives that can collaborate and work with others in health sciences, but brings a bit of equalization to the disparity that I think exists across this disciplinary divide. This is an ongoing conversation and hopefully an ongoing initiative. And so I want to invite all of you to take part in ARMS events in the future. And thank you once again for attending the symposium. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did, and feel free to continue to converse in the Gather Town space for the next 20 or so minutes. Aside from that, I'm going to say goodbye to everyone. And once again, thank you so much.
Thanks, Marissa.